Oh, again, I forgot my microphone. I lost my mindfulness there, didn't I? Anyway, good evening, friends, and welcome to our nightly meditation practice the second time. I'm happy to have you with me tonight. And as we do each night, we will begin by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Again, thank you for joining me tonight. And tonight I'm going to lead off by reading from the group of ones in the Itivuttaka. The Itivuttaka is part of the Khuddaka Nikaya, or the collection of sayings by the Buddha. So that includes the Dhammapada, the Gattas, the Therigattas, the Theragattas, the Itivuttaka, etc. Anyway, so these are the various sayings of the Buddha. And so the other night I was talking about the Kalama Sutta, or the Kesamutti Sutta, as it's also known, in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Book of Threes, discourse number 65. So I was talking about that the other night, and how the Buddha teaches us to make proper inquiry, and to test things out, to weigh them out. Does this lead to good, or does this lead to bad? Does this lead to an end of suffering, or does this lead to more suffering? Does this, those questions and answers that the Buddha was asking the people of the Kalamas to try out for themselves, to test whether the words of the Buddha were true or false, whether his teachings or the teachings of the other ascetics that were coming around and teaching to them were true or false, whether they led to good or evil, whether they led to liberation or to suffering. And so to continue that theme, I wanted to read from the Itivuttaka and a little bit of the commentary or notes that go along with this, because I think it's instructive, and I think it, again, tells us the questions we should be asking when we want to know, is something true? Is this a good teaching, a bad teaching, or what is this exactly? I say that, again, I've been caught up a little bit in this course on Buddhist Studies Online that I'm taking, about Indian Buddhist philosophy. And then I listened to a podcast earlier today, and there are so many questions raised by these philosophers that are totally outside of the teachings of the Buddha, in my opinion. They're asking questions and dwelling on issues of a very philosophical, epistemological basis, which don't necessarily lead to the cessation of suffering. And so they begin historically putting lots of words into the Buddha's mouth to teach their theory of knowledge, their philosophy, their epistemology. And it's somewhat disturbing to me. Now, I grant you, a lot of that has to do with my background and basis in Theravada Buddhism, and the Pali Canon, and yet as a Zen Buddhist practitioner, I also find them to be disingenuous. I find, as I was explaining the other day with my my Zen master, whom I study under, she is a dear, sweet teacher who really has a lot of insight, and I am very grateful to have her as my teacher. Anyway, so Master Miyoto and I were talking about this, and she has been a longtime student both of Zen and Vajrayana. So she's kind of a dual practice type of student, master. We're all students of the Buddha, right? So anyway, so she's kind of a dual practice practitioner, as I am, and I consider myself a Zen and Theravada type of dual practitioner. But I was telling her my philosophy on this because I think this course that I'm taking, she would really enjoy, because in a Vajrayana type of sense, Tibetan Buddhism type of sense, they get really down into the weeds on this philosophy of the world, of the cosmos, of life, that stems from these various schools, particularly the Yogacarans and the Madhyamakas in ancient India, which were two schools that came about after several hundred years after the Buddha had passed into his parinibbana. Anyway, it leads me, every time I listen to these lectures and sit through these classes that we have, it leads me shaking my head just a little bit that these are kind of like nice to know answers. No, not even that. Let me say, these are like mental exercises that are very important to people who have this very education-based foundation for their belief system. Which really gets into the philosophy of it all. But to me, loses a lot of the Buddha's focus on the core question. Does this lead to the cessation of suffering? Yes or no? Because if it does, then it's good and keep going. If it does not, you're probably wasting your time on it, at least if you're trying to accomplish what the Buddha was teaching. So there we have it. So let me go to the Itivuttaka and read to you this particular saying, or this particular portion. As I mentioned, this is in the group of one, so this is the Itivuttaka 1, number 16. So if I can share that with you here. Okay, so here we go. Number 16, or section 16, it says, "This was said by the Blessed One, said by the Arahant, so I have heard. With regard to internal factors, I don't envision any other single factor like appropriate attention." There's a footnote 1 there that we'll get to at the end here. "As doing so much for a monk in training, who has not attained the heart's goal, but remains intent on the unsurpassed safety from bondage. A monk who attends appropriately abandons what is unskillful and develops what is skillful. Appropriate attention as a quality of a monk in training. Nothing else does so much for attaining the superlative goal. A monk striving appropriately attains the ending of stress. Stress here translated from the word dukkha. So sometimes called suffering, sometimes called stress. The original word in Pali was dukkha. So I want to read the notes here because the notes are very important because it gets to the meat of what I was talking about. So the notes, when it talks about up here, what is appropriate attention? So the notes for number 1 here. Appropriate attention, yoniso manasikara, is the ability to focus attention on questions that lead to the end of suffering. That's from the Majjhima Nikaya number 2, which lists the following questions as not fit for attention. Was I in the past? Was I not in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Shall I be in the future? Shall I not be in the future? What shall I be in the future? How shall I be in the future? Am I? Am I not? What am I? How am I? Where has this being come from? Where is it bound? The discourse also lists the following issues as fit for attention. This is stress, i.e. suffering. This is the origination of stress. This is the cessation of stress. This is the way leading to the cessation of stress. And so, as it said up there previously, that a person in training, a monk in training, but it means anyone in training, is one who has attained at least the first level of awakening, a sotapanna, but not yet the final level. So what is a sotapanna? What is a person in training? A person in training is someone who has recognized what is not self. Okay? And we've talked about that many times before, that not self is I am not my collection of aggregates. Okay? And it's a person who has accepted and understood the Four Noble Truths and the mission of the Buddha. And when one has accomplished those things in a real sense, not just in I'm a Buddhist, so I believe in the Four Noble Truths, but one really begins to understand what those Four Noble Truths are. And once one has done that and has been able to abandon that idea of self, and really has begun to abandon that greed, hatred, and delusion, you're starting to let go of your attachments. You haven't let go of them all, of course not, but you're starting to, and you're starting to understand how to do that. That's someone who's reached that first stage of awakening. And by doing so, that's considered to be a person in training. If you haven't done that yet, then you're not quite at this level of asking the right questions and abandoning these other questions, because you really haven't learned to abandon that concept of a self, of an eternal self, is what I mean by that. So that's what the Buddha's getting at here, is appropriate attention. That is the single factor most likely to help someone in their goal of ending suffering. And therefore, when he says unsurpassed safety from bondage, he means liberation from the cycle of samsara. That's what he means, nirvana. So this appropriate attention is what goes hand in hand with the teaching to the Kalamas in Anguttara Nikaya 365. So I just wanted to point this out, that asking these appropriate questions, like he was teaching us with the Kalamas, that's how we learn to end suffering. And so that's why I'm struggling a little bit with this deep Buddhist philosophy development issues, because it dwells on issues that the Buddha did not think were important. And because of that, it really formulates ideas that are not relevant to the Buddhist teachings. So anyway, I was going back to my teacher, Master Myodo. And she and I were having this discussion that, that I thought she would really enjoy this course a lot more than I do, because as a practitioner of Vajrayana, some of these really esoteric type of philosophical discussions are inherent in Tibetan Buddhism. And it's a noble lineage that they have passed down. I'm not disparaging it in any way. It's just very different from my own. But I was giving her my example of this spectrum that I find in Buddhism. And this is just my own development, having studied Buddhism now for several years. I find it like this. So on this spectrum, and let's say way over here on my right side, your left side on the screen here, way over here is this highly philosophical level of Buddhism. And then way over here is the most simplistic form of what's the base of what the Buddha taught. Okay, so over here, super philosophical, over here, super practical. And then where do we meet in between? And so for me, as a student of both the Zen and a student of the Theravada style of Buddhism, or school of Buddhism, I find myself over here in the very basic. Here's what the Buddha taught. Here's what's going to lead to the end of suffering and the end of the cycle of samsara. Over here is this deep philosophical, asking lots of questions that are, to me, outside of ending the cycle of samsara. So here's my Theravada Buddhism that I studied for many years under several wonderful teachers, principally the Venerable Kemananda, whom I love. He is a great teacher. But Zen goes even further over here. So Zen takes the basics of Buddhism and says, Zen practitioners, or at least the early masters of Zen practitioners, took that basics of Buddhism and said, what's even more basic? What is that root of what the Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree? Even more basic than grasping and the cessation of suffering. And just before we even start to form these words, before that nama rupa comes into our head, what's even more basic than that? And that's what the Zen practitioners took. They took that from Taoism, no doubt, as you've seen me develop in this as I've been studying Taoism. That's what the Zen practitioners took. They took Taoism and its very basic beliefs and merged it with the meditative practices of Buddhism to really delve into the even deeper, more basic ideas of existence. Not just man's existence, but all existence. This basic ontological existence of nature. And I find both of those, to me as a practitioner, very palatable. And I find that those two approaches are compatible with each other, more so, in my opinion, than a very deeply philosophical approach, which I think probably dwells on a lot of these questions the Buddha said you don't really need to worry about. Not that worrying on them is going to produce ill effects. I'm not convinced in any way whatsoever that they lead to evil, but they add more to it than I think is necessary. So I'm searching for that. And I'm trying to keep this idea of, this appropriate investigation idea foremost in my mind. What are the right questions to ask, and what's the right way to prove it out? And I don't know that there's a great answer for it. I'm still studying for it. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you from the Itivuttaka. I think that's the first time I've read something to you besides something from the Dhammapada that was from the Khuddaka Nikaya. And maybe I've read something from the Theravada before. Part of the stories of Kisa Gotami, which we've talked about before, are included in the Theravada. And I love the story of Kisa Gotami, you know I do. Anyway, so having discussed that a little bit, I invite you to meditate on it. To meditate, what are these right questions? In Zen, we frequently want to be left in that not knowing mentality. What is this? Don't know. What is this? Don't know. By saying that, by coming to that don't know mentality, in Zen, we believe that it leaves our minds open for accepting things as they really, really are, which is of critical importance. Often we see things not as they are, but as we think they are, or as we perceive them. And when we perceive them one way, but in reality they are another, we are not seeing the truth. We are only seeing a perception. And it leads us astray in many ways. You know, I've used before this example of colored balls, and it's very interesting when we see things that we think are one way, but in reality are another. And so I'll just briefly, I'll show you that again, and you'll see what I mean. But when we look at this picture here, we see yellowish green, red, bluish gray balls, and we see them all different colors. But in reality, they are all the same color. But the colored lines and the ones that show up in each ball makes it tell our minds interpret or extrapolate that that's the color of the ball. But in reality, they are all this beige looking color that is just a perfect example, I believe, of how our mind plays tricks on us and how we do not see reality for what it can and always is. We see it in our own way. So I've zoomed this in here to show you, if you look on the left and look on the right, the balls are the same color. And yet when we zoom out, one appears a reddish color and one appears a bluish gray color. And it is just our minds telling us one thing is one way when the reality is something different. So I just use that as an example of the world is not always as we see it. Reality is not always as we see it. And we have to look deeper. We have to ask those right questions that the Buddha tells us. Study it out. Investigate for yourself. And you can find that life is not always what it appears to be. So paying that appropriate attention, as mentioned in the Itivuttaka, is, I think, as the Buddha said, it is the single factor most likely to lead to someone in training being released from bondage or being released from that cycle of samsara. So I encourage you, if you haven't read any of the Itivuttaka before, there are lots of good things in there. And like I said, they're all very short. I can share that with you one last time. So if you've never studied the Itivuttaka before, I encourage you to take a look at it. This is from Access to Insight. You can also find it in Sutta Central. But you see, these are short, and There's some notes, usually to most of them, that help explain to us things that we might not know or might not understand the context for. But these are all quite short. And like I said, this one right here is the Book of Ones. And so they're all aimed at the Buddha saying there is one thing, there is this one concept, there is this one idea, etc. Much like in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Book of Ones and the Anguttara Nikaya. So anyway, it's something worth looking at, something worth sorting out and reading. There are some good things there. It doesn't take long to read them, and you really get a good foundation for what the Buddha was teaching. So I hope that was somewhat instructive, or at least give you something to think about as you think about investigating and asking those questions. Will this lead to my continued suffering, or will it lead to the end of my suffering? So with that, we will turn to our meditation practice. And I invite you to listen to the bells and enjoy this Insight Timer's 25 minutes of meditation practice for us. Thank you, friends, for meditating with me tonight. We will close, as we do each night, with the reading of the Bodhicitta prayer. The Bodhicitta prayer. With a wish to free all beings, I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the Buddha's presence, I generate the mind for full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. As long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. Thank you, friends, very much, and I hope to see you again tomorrow night. Good night.